virtues, so to speak, that are presented in chapter 10. Remember we talked about righteousness, diligence, and honesty. And we looked at the comparisons. Remember, it's a contrasting comparison that we're using, okay? Talked about the wise son versus the foolish son, and the contrasting nature of the results or the attributes of both the foolish as well as the wise son. Tonight we want to pick up in verse 11, because we want to talk about a controlled tongue. And of course we know that James does spends a great deal of time in talking about that in the New Testament. But here we'll look at the moral virtue of controlling one's tongue. In chapter 10, beginning in verse 11, the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. On the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him who lacks sense. The wise son, verse 11, his mouth is as a fountain of life. What that's saying, of course, is, and we know from our own personal experience, that the wise one always speaks with God in mind. It's a fountain of life because it speaks of righteousness. It's a fountain of life because it speaks of God's way and the life that is found only in him. Remember that in Jeremiah 2:13, Jeremiah, the prophet, said, Israel, God speaking through Jeremiah, Israel, my people have rejected me, and he refers to himself. God refers to himself as the fountain of living waters. So it is a common reference to the life-giving that God gives to his people. Now, verse 12, it says, love covers all offenses. That's in the ESV, wrongs, the NIV, sins, New King James, and King James, and of course, transgressions in the New American Standard. They all mean the same thing. Love does not ignore sin. Out of a love for one another, will protect the sinner in such a way as to save his or her soul. 1 Peter 4:8. Let's go there. First Peter 4:8, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. And in James 5:20, one more page. James 5:20, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. What does that expression mean? What does it mean to cover a multitude of sins, or to cover all sins, to cover all offenses? Does that mean to hide them? No. How do we, as an individual, cover anybody else's sins? Well, what does that expression mean, though, to cover them? It's interesting, if you look up the definition, even in a secular dictionary, if you look up the definition of cover, one of the definitions is to treat. Is to treat or attack, okay? Or to, do away with, okay? Yes, it can mean to conceal, but that's not what we're dealing with here. Because ultimately, sin may be concealed from us, but it can never be concealed from God, okay? So we can't assume that that's what this expression means, because that would make no sense in when we think of God and His grace, okay? But what it does mean is exactly as has been expressed in a number of different ways, okay? When we love each other enough to point out sin to each other, what we do for one another is we make sure that everybody is availing themselves of the grace of God. No, nobody can make a decision for anybody else in terms of what they do about their lives or about the decisions they make in their lives or the sin in their life. But when we encourage, when we instruct, when we help those who may have sin in their life to come back into the grace of God, as we say, that's what love is about. And that's what it means to cover sins. Because it does offer them an opportunity to go to God and to have their sins forgiven. Because without that, if no one ever points that out, if no one ever takes the time to love someone enough to point out sin in their life, they may never take care of that sin the way they're supposed to. And so when we love each other earnestly, as the Scripture says, that means we look out for each other in terms of our spiritual lives. Okay, verse 13. In his lips wisdom is found. Again, this person does not stir up trouble. They don't use rash or foolish words, but the truth is always spoken with grace, as Colossians 4:6 says. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned with what? Salt, okay? What does that mean? Seasoned with salt. What does it mean to have your speech seasoned with salt? What does that mean? It preserves, and it also does what? When you put, what's that? It makes it more palatable, absolutely, okay? Makes it more palatable. So when one speaks from wisdom, wisdom makes it easier to take, easier to understand, easier to absorb, so to speak, okay? When you speak with grace and compassion in your heart to anyone, it makes that more palatable to them, okay? Yes? Right. That's right. Okay? Okay, verse 14. Verse 14. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. It's verse 13, sorry. The wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool brings ruin near. It stores up or lays up knowledge. The righteous keep knowledge in their hearts, in their speech at all times. Okay? They always choose the right occasion to speak also. At least they should try to, most of the time. All right? Any thoughts on the positive side of this before we go to the negative side, the foolish son? Okay, now let's look at the opposite now. Let's look at the contrast. The foolish son. The foolish son always causes strife because of their uncontrolled tongue. Verses 11 and 12, he stirs up strife. His words bring sorrow. He's a talebearer. He's a murmurer. Okay? Jealous, backbiting. All of these lead to trouble. And later on, when we get to chapter 26, in our study as Charles continues to take us through it, this subject and this topic comes up again. Okay? The foolish son does not control his tongue. He stirs things up. Okay? Verse 13. This is worthy of some discussion here. Verse 13. A rod is for the back of him who lacks sense. What does the rod in this context mean? Remember, in other contexts, we have it to mean a discipline, okay? To be disciplined. What does it mean in this context? It's not the rod of discipline, it's the rod of what? Okay. That's one thought. Specifically here, I think it's talking about punishment. Okay? This is not the same sense as in 13:24. What does 13:24 say? You remember? A lot of us quote it all the time. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. See? This is not the same as 13:24. It's specifically talking about you've got a foolish son who is not controlling his mouth, stirring up strife, backbiting, tale-bearing, or whatever. He lacks sense. He deserves to be punished. It's different than when you're trying to bring a child up and you bring them up slowly and gradually with a rod of discipline. Okay? But specifically here, and the reason that I believe this is because of this expression, he lacks sense. Literally, what that means is he does not have God in his heart. Literally, that's what that means. Okay? A fool, in the Bible sense, remember, is one who is ignorant of God's ways. A fool does not know God's ways. One who lacks sense means that they have no desire to know God's way. They literally do not have God in their heart. And in this case, God's grace does not work to their benefit, but rather it's God's wrath is what they deserve. Okay? So I believe that in this particular context, we're talking about the rod of punishment rather than the rod of discipline or training. Okay? Right. Let's look at some other scriptures that supports this thought, okay? Let's look at 19:29. Proverbs 19:29. And if you disagree with me, please speak up. But I will try to point out some scriptures that I believe supports this interpretation of it. Chapter 19, verse 29. Condemnation is ready for scoffer. What's a scoffer? It's an unbeliever. Okay, one who knows not God and doesn't have a desire to know God. Okay, Condemnation is ready for scoffers and beating for the backs of fools. Okay? Now let's go to, 26:3. Now, in context here, Solomon is talking about making a slightly different kind of comparison, okay? Because he talks like, the word like, so like this is, so is this, okay? And he talks about like summer or rain in harvest, honor is not fitting for a fool, etc. And then look at verse 3. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the back of fools. Okay? And then let's look at Proverbs 6:32. He who commits adultery lacks sense. Same expression means the same thing. He who commits adultery lacks sense. He who does it destroys himself. Okay? Any additional thoughts on that before we move on? Okay, verse 14. His mouth, ESV brings ruin near. I think New American Standard says ruin is at hand. I think the New King James is near destruction. Okay? The uncontrolled tongue is always putting his foot in his mouth, right? Someone who does nothing but talk invariably will end up putting their foot in their mouth probably more than once, okay? And they also will continue to talk so long that what they do is they start bringing condemnation down on themselves. Because they typically, you cannot depend on someone who is uncontrollably talking. You don't know whether they're telling the truth or not. You can't always depend on their word. Sometimes people like to talk a lot to make you think they're a lot smarter than they actually are. But if you listen to them long enough, you realize that they're really not as smart as they think they are. Okay? So, that's why in that sense, they bring trouble upon themselves and to others because they do not control their tongue and they continue to do a whole lot more talking than they do listening. Okay? Okay. Now that we've talked about the four attributes, okay, the last part of the chapter talks about why these things are the best things. Remember at the introduction, we talked about these being for the best things, okay, in life. Now, the last part of the chapter, chapter 10, verses 15 through 32, tell us why, speak to the issue of why these are the best things. Verses 15 through 17, righteousness will be rewarded with life. A rich man's wealth is his fortress or strong city, I don't know which version you're reading. The poverty of the poor is their ruin. This is not saying that everybody is rich is great and everybody that's poor is not great, okay? Let's look and examine at it very carefully as what's intended and what's meant by it, okay? And yes, we do know that 1 Timothy says, the love of money, okay? But, that's not what it's necessarily talking about. There is nothing wrong with wealth in and of itself, okay? We have many fine Christians who have great wealth, and they use it to God's honor, to God's glory, okay? What we're dealing with here is, and that's why when they have the proper priority on it, the proper sense about it, that's why it's their fortress, or it's their strength, or it's their strong city, as some of the versions say. Because it secures them, in some cases, from danger. It secures them from and provides them opportunity sometimes that others might not have the opportunity of, to be compassionate. So wealth can be a source of strength when it's used properly. Okay? Now, on the other hand, there's nothing wrong with poverty in and of itself. We recognize that there are people in this world that are not as fortunate as some of us, some as fortunate as other people. But there is a time when poverty can bring ruin to the individual. In what sense would poverty bring ruin to a person who is in poverty? It has nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with money. Remember that the person with wealth has to have the right attitude. Well, how about the person that's living in poverty? They got to have the right attitude also. If they have an attitude of, woe is me, or what does one of the commandments say? Thou shalt not what? And covet. Okay, you're absolutely right. All right? So when a person is in poverty, because of that poverty, they set about taking from others, or they covet what others have, that is their ruin, because that's the wrong attitude. Okay? They're not living with the attitude that God wants them to have. And eventually, when someone becomes so bitter or so covetous, they end up bringing ruin upon themselves, because most of the time, at some point, you're going to get caught and you're going to end up in trouble with, if not your neighbor, you're sure going to be in trouble with the law. Okay? So whether you have wealth or you are impoverished, attitude is the key. Attitude is the key about either one of those. Okay, verses 16 and 17. The wage of the righteous leads to life, the gain of the wicked to sin. Whoever heeds instruction is on the path to life, but he who rejects reproof leads others astray. The wages or the work of the righteous brings life, or leads to life, or New American Standard says is life. The purpose for living is gained by seeing life from God's point of view. Again, there is nothing wrong with having things, but it is wrong when things have you. It's a big difference, right? Or when you want things, they consume you. When one less material considerations get in their way, and they become, and those things become God to you rather than the Almighty God, then that is definitely a problem, and you become as the rich fool was in the parable of the rich fool. Okay? In Luke, the 12th chapter, verses 15 through 21. The truly rich, if a person is truly and honestly and sincerely rich, they will use their prosperity for the Lord. Okay? They will also acquire those things or do those things with their riches that have a value to life itself. Remember what Matthew, the 6th chapter, teaches us about laying up treasures on on the earth versus in heaven? And what it teaches us about the fact that God knows what we need. Okay? And if he takes care of those sparrows, he'll sure take care of us. Right? But our priority is to do what? Our priority is to seek his kingdom, and then he'll provide you all those things that you need. Okay? Also, verse 18. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. A controlled tongue is as valuable as choice silver. That's down in verse, where'd it go? 20, okay? The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, the heart of the wicked is of little worth. Verse 21, the lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of sense. There is nothing, well, this is my opinion, okay? But to me, and has been, I think, probably most of my life, if not always, the most treasured character trait that anyone can have is their integrity. If you have a habit of not telling the truth, and people come to know it, they begin to realize they cannot depend upon you. A person who is telling a story the second time doesn't need to try to remember how he told it the first time. Right? A lying tongue, anyone who harbors hatred in their heart and speaks to injure others also, proves a lack of wisdom. You do not build yourself up by cutting others down. The Septuagint, verse 18, by the way, lying lips and slander, verse 18, the one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. The Septuagint puts it this way: he who forgives hatred has righteous lips, but he who spreads defamation is a fool. Okay? And remember what that means in Bible sense. In the Bible, okay? So, the wise will overlook offenses and will certainly seek to avoid destroying a friend. A person who destroys others is not a friend to any of those, okay? And cannot be trusted. Verse 19. When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Here's an interesting thought, and probably one you've heard many, many times. God gave us one mouth and two ears. He wants us to listen more than we speak. Okay? With some, it's just the opposite. They speak a lot more than they listen. Okay? So, we ought to listen twice as much as we speak. James 1:19 also, right? Swift to and slow to speak, okay? When a person talks too much, that's a good sign that his words are not worth listening to. Okay? Verses 20 and 21. The righteous person will speak wisdom, and that makes his voice as choice silver. But the lack of wisdom is uttered by the fool, is of little worth. Any questions, thoughts, additional thoughts before we go on to the next one? Verses 22 through 32, we won't read them, but that section deals with, again, the blessing of the Lord upon giving security to the upright. Verse 22, through righteousness one attains real security in life. Contentment and peace can only come from righteous living. I mean, let that soak in for a minute. Contentment and peace can only come from righteous living. If you're not living a righteous life, you have turmoil in your life. And I'm not talking about us having ills. We're flesh and blood, so, we have ills, we have aches and pains just like everybody else. God didn't promise freedom from pain. In fact, he gave us pain so we'd know when we got something wrong, okay? But truly, peace of mind and comfort of life comes only from living for God. If you're living for things, if you're living for other than God, you're not going to have peace and comfort in your life. Okay? When we were at Sierra Bible Camp, Andy Jensen from Central in Sacramento did a great lesson using John. The vine and the branches, 15, okay? Did a great lesson on that when he contrasted being happy versus having joy. One is happy only for a little while. Things happen in your life, it makes you feel happy, right? Happy things happen to you. But real joy is lasting. And when you reach the point at which God is first in your life, you put your life in the hands of God, you allow him to control your life instead of yourself, that brings joy to you because you know you have the peace and the comfort that nobody else can realize unless they are also doing the same. That's where real contentment and peace comes in and where real joy comes in. Okay, verses 23 through 25. The foolish man finds great amusement in doing evil, whereas the righteous man delights in wisdom. When the storm of judgment falls, the wicked will perish, and the righteous will stand. Okay? We don't have time to read it all, but go into Matthew, the 7th chapter, verses 24 through 27, Matthew 13, 49, and 25, 31 through 46, and read what's going to happen at the judgment. The righteous will go here, the unrighteous will go here. God will separate them. He'll send the righteous to their reward. He'll send the evil, or those that are on to condemnation. When judgment comes, of which we have no control, it's appointed end to man wants to die, even if we're not alive when Jesus comes back. Okay? When we go to our grave, that's the end of our time to do anything about anything. Okay? When we go to our physical grave, right? When judgment falls, the wicked will perish, the righteous will stand. Verse 26 talks again about the irritation caused by an unreliable sluggard. We've talked enough about that. We'll go on to verses 27 through 30. Remember what we said. Remember that Proverbs are not absolutes, okay? They are general maxims. Generally speaking, okay? Generally speaking. They're not fixed laws with no exception, but is a maxim that is generally true. So, generally speaking, long life, gladness, and strength will come to the righteous, okay? That may not happen here on earth. But we can be assured that long life will occur when we leave this earth, for sure, those that are living righteously. And that is the source of our true gladness, and that is the source of our strength and our hope. Whereas those who do not live righteously are bound to be burdened with frustration, turmoil, Oftentimes, their choices in life bring about a shortening of their life. Think about all of the different ways. Think about all the different ways that one's life can be shortened because of bad decisions. And destruction is the reward of those who do evil. If not here on earth, certainly at the judgment, destruction will come. Okay? And then verses 31 and 32, we're actually going to make it. Verses 31 and 32, the lips of the righteous speak only what is proper. A perverse tongue will play the devil's advocate, may play the devil's advocate, confounding and twisting moral judgment, but this only invites divine punishment. Here's some of the synonyms for perverse: corrupt, self-willed, stubborn, stiff-necked. And here's my favorite one: pig-headed. Okay? Chapter 10, very quickly, remember, gives us 4 moral virtues that are part of God's way, okay? That needs to be part of our life, okay? And then the reasons that the reason that those are good things to possess is revealed in the last part of the chapter. I saw a hand up here a second ago. Yes, ma'am. Yep. Well spoken. I think all of us who have been on this earth for any length of time can look back at our own lives, and we can think of those times when we may not have allowed God to be our guide. We made decisions that were self-serving. We made decisions or choices that weren't the best choice to make as it relates to living a righteous life, and the kind of grief that it caused us at the time. But thank goodness, because of God's grace, we're all here tonight, and that's what really matters. And it's up to us to make the choices and to understand God's way and use God's way as our way throughout our life. Any final comments, questions, or whatever? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.